And I'm your host today. My name again is Meg Inglis, and then we have Kim Conroe, who is the immediate past president, and she will be monitoring the chat function. And before we even get started, I want to say that no effort like this can ever occur without a bunch of people behind the scenes working on it. Our next speaker is Lisa Gonzalez. She's going to speak about native plants and ecosystem resilience, the role of native plants and invasive species management in conserving biodiversity. As Vice President and Executive Director of Audubon, Texas, Lisa Gonzalez leads statewide strategy development for a dedicated team of conservation, policy, and educational professionals, but working to advance science, policy, education, and on-the-ground conservation to protect birds and the places that they need. Lisa joined the National Audubon Society in July 2021 after a nearly 20-year career with the Houston Advanced Research Center, serving in programmatic, not problematic, programmatic and executive leadership roles. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Texas A&M University at Galveston and the University of Houston Clear Lake. Lisa has led numerous initiatives, including the Quiet Invasion Invasive Species Field Guide series, which I'm really curious to see, honestly. That's a unique name. Invasive Species Risk Assessments, State of Galveston Bay Reports, and the Galveston Report Card. She applies ecological data, analytics, equitable community engagement, and sustainability best practice to advance conservation outcomes in alignment with issues such as climate change, nature-based infrastructure, green building, water management, and renewable energy. So I'd like to present Lisa Gonzalez.
Okay, I will share my screen. Thank you, Meg. Really appreciate that introduction, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you this morning. I am zooming in from Houston, although I have to say, I wish I was sitting in that grotto at West Cave. That was an amazing presentation, Kathy, and I can't wait to visit. I loved the questions, fantastic questions. And, there was the question about translating information from places like West Cave to landscape architects. And I think that's a really nice connection into this talk, because that's what part of what we're going to talk about this morning is what is ecosystem resilience and how do native plants and invasive species play a part of that. We won't be talking about the quiet invasion this morning, but I'll be sure and put a link in the chat so that folks can check out that resource if that's something that interests you. So at the National Audubon Society, we are a bird conservation organization, but native plants and invasive species are two issues that really permeate all 5 of our program areas that you see here on the screen. And these issues are so important in our coastal program, the climate work that we do, our grasslands conservation programs, which is what we call working lands, water, of course, and bird-friendly communities. Those are our urban conservation programs. So just wanted to call that to your attention. At Audubon, Texas, we have 21 staff around the state. There are 22 Audubon chapters in the state of Texas. So no matter where you're calling in from today, I happen to be calling in from Houston. Like I said, there's very likely an Audubon chapter near you. We also have 3 Audubon centers around the state, 2 in Dallas, the Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center, the Trinity River Audubon Center, Mitchell Lake Audubon Center in San Antonio, and then the Sable Palm Sanctuary down in Brownsville that we manage with the Gorgas Science Foundation. If you haven't had a chance to visit those and you're in those parts of the state, I recommend that you come and check out those centers and those sanctuaries. Really great trails, wonderful education programs, lots of great native plants to see for sure. So today, now, this is interesting. Now that there we go. Now that I hid my controls, I couldn't quite move my slide. So for today's talk, We're going to really focus on talking about the topic of resilience, how issues like climate multiply the effects of other stressors that we see around us in our daily lives. We're going to talk about that shift to resilience thinking and what that means for us as a society and as Texans. And then we're going to connect in those issues of biodiversity, invasive species, native plants, and just really have a conversation in terms of connecting those topics. So I thought first we'd start, and I've got a puppy that's all of a sudden decided he has something to say to you all as well. So I thought we'd first start with the topic of making the case for resilience. So if you look at this map comes from NOAA, and it just shows that we've got a lot of work to do along the Gulf Coast in the state of Texas. This is a map that shows billion-dollar weather disasters going back to 1980, so nearly 41 years of data. And as you can see from this map, Texas wins the prize, a prize that we don't want to win, for the greatest number of billion-dollar weather disasters in the United States. Louisiana edges us out just a little bit in terms of the cost of those disasters, but not by much. But you know, that also shows that we've got a lot of opportunity for resilience thinking, and native plants are a big part of that, especially in our neighborhoods, our urban areas, and our communities. So if you've ever seen a presentation by Dr. Catherine Hay-Ho, who's a climate scientist at Texas Tech University, if you have, you know, she's just a wonderful science communicator. She gives fantastic presentations. She's also got a wonderful podcast that you can find. It's a video podcast that you can find on Facebook called Global Weirding. One of the things that she talks about when we're thinking about climate is climate as a multiplier. So we've got these issues that we already think about in Texas. This is the US drought map showing drought conditions around the US and in Texas in late February. You can see we've already got some dry conditions in places around the state. This is a map from NOAA showing agricultural yields and projected agricultural yields. Those areas in red are areas that show potential declines in yields. We can also think about energy expenditures. Those areas in the darker shades of red are parts of the country and parts of Texas where we might expect to see increased energy expenditures around the state. And then social vulnerability, and that's the degree to which communities and people are vulnerable to stressors because of sociological issues, whether it be access to education, access to health resources, things like poverty, whether someone's extremely young, whether someone's elderly. All of these issues are things that we think about and deal with as a society on a daily basis. But we can consider climate as a multiplier of those issues, or a threat multiplier. On top of that, and this is a map that was just released this week by NatureServe. It was published in the New York Times. I've put a link here on the slide, but this NatureServe map that just came out shows those areas around the United States, and again in Texas, where we are seeing potential threats to biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And that means potential loss of habitats, potential loss of species in the coming years. And if you focus in on the state of Texas, you can see that a lot of those areas highlighted in red are around or actually follow our watersheds and our river systems around the state. One of the other really interesting things is that, as this slide says, 70% of areas with important and potentially unprotected species, 70% of those areas are private lands. In Texas, that number is even higher. 96% of our lands in the state of Texas are privately owned. So that just means there's also the tremendous potential for ecosystem resilience and resilience thinking when it comes to private landowners. And for everyone on this, attending this symposium today, who has an interest in native plants has the potential to play a huge role in ecosystem resilience, in conservation for the state of Texas moving forward. These are some graphics that Audubon released back in some data that Audubon released back in 2019, so a little over 2 years ago. This is our survival by degrees report. And I encourage you to go to that website and check out the report. And there's a report specific to Texas that you can download. And that's where these graphics come from. But it just shows that for us in Texas, and this is something that Audubon feels strongly about, climate is one of the greatest issues facing us when we're thinking about birds, bird habitat, and overall biodiversity in the state. You can see from this graphic that some of the habitats that we're looking at that could be impacted are our forested lands, our grasslands. These show number of species that could be impacted in summer, species that are found here in the state, species of birds that are found here during the winter, and some of the potential, the number of species that could be impacted. More than 70 species of birds, 76 species of birds have been identified by Audubon as being moderately or highly vulnerable to changes in climate. When we look at this graphic down here on the left, you can see the stressors that we typically think about in the state of Texas. But if we want to focus in on just a handful, and I'm setting the stage for how I'm going to get to native plants, I promise, but I'm setting the stage for how we can think about native plants and how we can think about invasive species in the future in the context of climate and in the context of resilience. When we look at this list of stressors here on the bottom left, those that have the potential to impact the greatest amount of acreage in the state of Texas, and for us at Audubon, the greatest number of species of birds, are those stressors relating to urbanization. The secret is out. Everybody knows that Texas is a great place to live, and we've got more and more people moving into the state. And when we're thinking about the future, whether it's this report, whether we're looking at something like the Houston Climate Assessment, whether we're looking at the 4th National Climate Assessment, for our part of the country in Texas, it's really stressors like heat and drought that we're looking at in the future. We are certainly going to continue to see our extreme events related to things like freezes, even those may be more rare, and they've been decadal in occurrence, those large freezes. We're still going to see those flood events, those extremes, but overall, when we're thinking about looking at things like precipitation, overall annual average precipitation is expected to hold roughly steady moving into the future. It's just we're going to see more of those deluges and extreme events. But in terms of annual averages, it's things like drought, it's things like extreme heat that we really got to be on the lookout for in Texas moving forward. So there's a lot going on in this graphic, but this just starts to, I think, show us that we can begin to change our mindsets from focusing on stressors to something that's more positive. And, I think that's something that happens a lot when we talk about issues like climate. We do get so focused on what we're seeing happen around us, and especially those extreme events that we face in our communities and in Texas, that we tend to focus on the negative. And those impacts are highlighted here in this graphic on the left, especially by these red arrows showing the connectivity between climate and human society and ecosystems. But I also want to draw our attention to this graphic on the right. because when we start to develop that resilience set, we can actually begin to lessen the impacts in the future and really begin to have an impact on the positive, where we have our human systems, our communities being able to mitigate climate, being able to conserve and restore our ecosystems. And when we look at our ecosystems, our ecosystems such as our habitats and lands, our freshwater systems, can also mitigate climate change in the future and also provide ecosystem services to our human systems, our communities, our society. So it's all connected, but we also have the potential to do a lot of really great things in the future. Very often, as I said, we end up focusing on the hazards that are potentially out there, on our exposure to those hazards. But I think it's really our vulnerability that we have the ability to positively impact moving forward. And that's, we can lessen our vulnerability by, really taking into account our activities as they can relate to increasing ecosystem resilience. So what is ecosystem resilience? So if you talk to any ecologist around the state, you're probably going to get a different definition. There are dozens of definitions out there, but I'd like to go with one today that I think is really pretty all-encompassing. And ecosystem resilience is the ability of a natural ecosystem to maintain its function. So, you think of a coastal prairie or a post oak savanna, each one of those different types of habitats and the ecosystem that it supports, the plants, the critters, the environmental factors are different from, habitat type to habitat type. So resilience is when an ecosystem can maintain its function, can maintain its processes. Those are things like nutrient cycling, contributions to the hydrological cycle, things like that. Can an ecosystem that's resilient can maintain its production and the abundance and the diversity of species that it has, and it can also maintain the services, the ecosystem services that it provides to society, especially after being subjected to damage caused by a disturbance, whether it's a flood, a drought, an extreme freeze event. And when we're thinking about ecosystem resilience, there are really two components to that resilience concept that we want to focus in on, and that's resistance and recovery. Resistance is the ability to withstand a disturbance, and the recovery is the rate of return to an original or almost original state. I think if we go back a year and we look at maybe what for those of us that have native plants in pollinator gardens around our homes or in the nature centers that we work at or love to visit, I think we can see that, yes, those habitats were impacted by the freeze, but they were probably a little more resistant to that impact than perhaps those yards of our neighbors that have, maybe focused on some of those more semi-tropical or tropical species that come from other parts of the world. Also, for those of us that have native plants in and around our homes after the freeze, while the freeze may have hit those plants hard, for the most part, they did recover and return to somewhat of an original state. It may have taken a little bit longer last year than in a typical year, but I think that most of us can attest to those native plant habitats that we plant around our homes and in our neighborhoods were a little more resilient to something like that freeze than if we had managed those habitats in ways that are kind of I guess more traditional or what you might see out there in terms of the mainstream, what's available through plant nurseries and that sort of thing. So why does biodiversity matter to us as people? I think all of us on this call today who care about ecosystems and habitats and native plants, everyone on this call gets it. But there was a great book that came out last year, published by or authored by Catherine Hayhoe, climate scientist at Texas Tech University, and it's called Saving Us. And it's a really great book, really positive. And what she talks about is how to communicate with other people about tough issues, whether it's talking to someone about biodiversity or native plants, if that someone maybe quite doesn't get it, and maybe they don't care about native plants, but you want them to. The topic could be climate, if that's something that's important to you and you want to talk to someone about it. They don't really care about it. It can be a tough conversation. But what she says is the way to have these conversations is to talk to people about what they care about and help those people connect what they care about to the issue that you're wanting to talk to them about. And so if we're thinking about biodiversity and native plants in that way, then, what matters to people is, they sustain life, they provide those ecosystem goods and services that affect our daily lives. Maybe somebody has a child that you're talking to has a child or a grandchild that has asthma. The health of that person is really important. We can talk to people about how native plants, benefit our health in a positive way, and the list goes on. But it's about framing these topics in ways that matter to people, so that we can connect these issues again to the things that they care about and begin to bring them along with us. So I think that's just an important topic to mention as we think about these issues of resilience in native plants and invasive species. So there's a lot of new reports coming out in the early part of this year. There was a study that was released in the last month that updates the cost figures for invasive species across the United States. It's estimated now that between 1960 and 2020, according to this study anyway, and the citations down at the bottom, I'll certainly share this presentation with Meg and the team if anyone's interested in following up on any of these resources. But this latest study estimates that between 1960 and 2020, we're looking at $1.2 trillion in costs around the United States related to invasive species. And if you look in that area on the map, that's pink, that includes Texas. We're talking about $2 billion worth of costs during that time period to the region of the United States that includes Texas. Annual invasion costs are high, anywhere from now approaching $21 billion a year in terms of it costs due to invasions. And costs can include costs to control and manage invasive species. They can include losses caused by invasive species, so crop losses, maybe losses in water yield, things like that. But I think this is just a really good graphic to kind of set the stage for, why invasive species continue to be a really important issue to us in the United States. Again, not just from the standpoint of invasives cause harm to ecosystems, something again that everyone in this audience today really cares about. But if we're thinking about how to communicate invasive species to others, these figures around costs are something that can be really effective for us. So going back a little bit, those of you who have been involved with the Native Plant Society of Texas or chapters around the state have very likely seen presentations and talks on invasive species over the years. It continues to be a really important issue. I thought it was just important that we kind of revisit today, maybe what are some of those common characteristics that help invasive species thrive. So if we remember, invasive species are species of plants, animals, and microbes that come to places like Texas from other parts of the world. Very often invasive species are distributed or dispersed by humans through a number of pathways that can include the plant and animal trade. It can include, things as simple as just the movement of cargo and supplies around the world. Movement of ships in the state of Texas. We've got pathways relating to boating and fishing and movement of mowing equipment. But invasive species continue to be an issue, of course, for us in the United States and in the state of Texas. And some of the reasons for why invasive species become invasive is this list on the left. And that's all of those characteristics, such as seed germination rates, rapid growth of populations. Very often invasive plants have multiple reproductive modes. They may reproduce sexually, they may reproduce just through vegetative means. They have tolerance to a wide variety of habitat types. Very often invasives are the first to show up when you have a disturbed area. And the list goes on and on. But if we go back to that original concept that we talked about of climate as a multiplier, that also applies to invasive species. All of the characteristics that make invasive species invasive also make them potentially more successful and more invasive when we factor in something like climate change. And here on the right, this is the list of all of those potential impacts of invasive species. And again, if you think about climate as that kind of multiplier event and extreme events as those multiplier events, if we focus in on a particular impact like fire regimes, we now know that invasive plants, particularly in Western states, are contributing to the increase in fires that we're seeing in places like California and Colorado. And also in terms of those impacts, invasive species introducing disease to agricultural crops. Climate again can play as a multiplier when we're thinking about these impacts that invasive species have on our human systems and our ecological systems as well. So we've got more and more research that's coming out every year that where researchers are looking at invasive species and how invasive species respond to climate change. So again, if we think about that list, all of those things that make an invasive are factor into this list that we see here on this slide. So altered climate variability creates disturbance. So, when we've got something like an extreme freeze and we've, got a die-off of some plants in a disturbed area or a flooded area that is extremely disturbed after an event, that creates opportunities for invasive species to take hold, especially when we have the things like those seed banks in place. Chinese tallow, one Chinese tallow tree can produce up to 100,000 seeds per year. So there's the tremendous potential for invasive species seed banks just kind of waiting for a disturbance event. Native species can be negatively impacted by climate change, again, creating some of those new opportunities for invasive species to take hold. There's more and more research that shows that as carbon dioxide levels increase, that can support greater rates of plant growth overall, but invasive species especially respond even more so than native species. We're beginning to see longer growing seasons and earlier onsets of spring. So invasive species are very often the first to take advantage of resources. And so as we're seeing these increased growing seasons, invasive species have the potential to benefit from that. As I said earlier, invasive species are able to adapt to a wide array of conditions. A Chinese tallow tree, which is Chinese tallow where I'm at in Houston, is now the most dominant tree species in the greater Houston region and has been for quite a few years. Chinese tallow does just as well under drought conditions as it does under flood conditions. Also, with climate change, we're seeing rates of change that are occurring faster than perhaps in systems under a normal climate regime. So climate change favors the species that can disperse quickly. Invasive species disperse really quickly, whether in a local environment in terms of seeds and plant material being able to be moved by wind and water. You've also got people, again, that are helping to move along the spread of invasives. We've also got fewer killing freezes. Last year, we certainly had one of those for all of the horrible and negative things that came out of that event. When we see, and we certainly wouldn't want to wish that event on ourselves again in the state of Texas, but when we see freezes, they can often have a beneficial impact on invasives, and that they can cause a die-off of some invasives, giving those native species perhaps a chance to come back. And when we have fewer killing freezes because we're seeing warmer winters overall on average, there's the potential for, again, those longer growing seasons and the greater number of life cycles, all promoting invasion. And then also warming increases populations of pest species. So if you look at, say, the number of pest insects in a place like Florida, there are going to be more in a place like Florida than, say, perhaps up in Maine. And, that's largely because they like warmer climates overall. So we could see the potential increase in pest populations. These figures at the right, at the top right, we're looking at USDA hardiness zones. The map at the left are how USDA mapped out hardiness zones in 1990. I think it's important to note that these zones are changing now as we're starting to see changes in growing seasons, changes in temperatures, in soil moisture, in rainfall. We're seeing these zones change. And then here on the bottom right, that's a map of areas at risk for kudzu invasion. So the area highlighted in red here on the bottom right of your screen, that's the area that has an increased risk for kudzu. But if you look at these cross-hatched areas, even those in blue, these are areas now that are identified as having the potential expanded risk for kudzu invasion, even out here on the West Coast. That's pretty amazing. So the data that we're seeing, whether it's through individual research studies, whether it's through data that's coming from NOAA, from the USDA, we can see that things are beginning to change around us. And I think now is the time for us to begin to adopt that mindset as we're thinking about invasive species and as we're thinking about the native species and native plants that we choose to bring into our yards, in our homes and our neighborhoods. So why are native plants a must for ecosystem resilience? Of course, everyone on this call knows that native plants are a must. And it's something that everyone here is very passionate about or very interested in learning more about. But native plants can, when we bring them into our communities, our neighborhoods, our homes, they do a number of really great things for us. They're adapted to our local conditions. And that's something that's important. They provide resources for other species, whether it's insects, including species of butterflies, birds, of course, something we care about at Audubon, other species of wildlife. Native plants also provide shelter for wildlife. Kathy showed those great images of golden cheek warbler in West Cave. That's a great example of native tree species providing shelter for species at risk, like golden cheek warbler. They require fewer resources like water, fertilizers, and pesticides. The less water that we use, the fewer pesticides that we use. That helps to make our systems more resilient. They also reduce pollutants. They filter pollutants in water. Native plants also help reduce air emissions. We don't often think about that, but the more native plants that we plant, the less mowing that we have to do. And that reduces air emissions in our communities. And they also help to mitigate climate change because they do sequester carbon, especially those trees we plant around our home. So when we're thinking about resilience in native plants, it's in addition to what I just mentioned, what native plants provide. If we're thinking about even just beyond the plants that we bring into our yards, but if we're interested in conserving energy in our homes, native plants can play a big part of that. If we strategically plant trees on the west and south sides of buildings and homes that can block the sun during the summer, and if they're deciduous trees and they drop their leaves and allow the sun to penetrate our buildings in the winter, that means we're using less energy. If we plant trees to shade our roofs, our exterior walls, our windows, our air conditioning units, again, that helps us conserve energy. Native plants also help us improve the organic matter in our soils. They help us avoid soil disturbance. They help us conserve water, especially if we're doing things like installing rain barrels, if we're adjusting water schedules, if we're using drip irrigation. All of this begins to not just help support the resilience of ecosystems and supporting populations of birds and wildlife and insects and other species, but it can really help make our homes and our neighborhoods and our communities more resilient. And they can even help us in terms of stormwater management. Where I live in Houston, that's a super important issue. The more that we can use native plants in our yards, in things like rain gardens, bioswales, vegetated buffers, the more that we can have resilient neighborhoods and slow down that flow of water, making its way into our storm drains rather than speeding it up and leading to more flood events. So this is kind of where we get into the what we can do portion of the discussion this morning. And I think it's about, there's an opportunity for us to also include this kind of thinking when we're thinking about the native plants that we want to choose to bring into our yards. It's always important to purchase native plants as much as we can from local sources. Everyone on this call knows that it's probably not always easy to find native plants in our local plant nurseries or the places that sell plants, like the big box stores and such. But when we can get locally sourced native plants, or those from the same or similar ecoregions, that's really great, because that means that they're adapted to local conditions, and maybe have the opportunity to continue to adapt as conditions change. Choose natives that can withstand stressors. We talked here in these maps, this is from the latest climate assessment that we have that shows potential temperatures, changes in temperatures in the mid-century, mid-21st century. So here in the next few decades, we can see the potential for some slight warming. This scenario right here on the left, this is, you'll hear in the news, folks talk about, are we going to see 1.5 degrees warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius and warming overall, or are we going to see, as high as 3 degrees Celsius warming overall? These are the climate scenarios, depending upon if we can mitigate and slow climate change, or whether, it's kind of business as usual. This is down here at the bottom right, is that extreme scenario of business as usual, and the increases in temperature that we could be seeing by the end of the 21st century in the United States and here in Texas. So we see some potentially significant increases in temperature overall. We can now start to think about, what are those native species that we can choose that can maybe withstand those stressors, like drier, sunnier conditions, greater heat stress, paying attention to those hardiness zones, and recognizing the fact that those hardiness zones are shifting, especially as we're thinking about species that are long-lived, things like trees that can potentially live for decades. We want to be sure that we're choosing species that aren't just adapted to this moment in time, but that could perhaps also be able to withstand things like drought conditions, less water, warmer temperatures overall. So for those people and organizations that work in that do restoration, like large scale ecological restoration, there's a term that's being used more and more, and that's adaptive management. I think it's also possible for us to apply adaptive management thinking to our own native plant selection around our homes, and on the properties that the folks on this call might manage. But when we're using an adaptive management mindset, which is really important to long-term resilience, what we're doing is it's an iterative process. It's, we're never finished adapting and adjusting as we get more information. But typically a process is, of course, we plan. So, we're out there looking in something like the Native Plant Information Network, the database that's there that's available at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center's website. So we're planning those species that we want to choose and plant this spring season, for example. Then the next step, of course, is to do the doing, where we actually do our plantings, but then that's not the end until next year. And I think this is probably something that native plant enthusiasts already inherently get, is that then we're continually monitoring how things are doing. We're evaluating how plants are adjusting to the conditions that we see. And then we make those adjustments before we plant again, and then start the process all over. But I think the more that we can pull this kind of mindset and adaptive management thinking into what we do, that gives us the even greater ability to create habitats and ecosystems around our homes that can adjust and adapt as conditions change through time moving forward. So I wanted to leave you all today with a couple of resources and just thoughts on maybe how we can use them moving forward. This is one that probably many people on this call are familiar with. This is the Native Plant Database at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And I just chose one of their special collections. This is the East Texas list that I know I look at when I'm trying to get ideas for plants to plant in Houston, and things that I might be looking for at native plant sales around town. But I think this is where we can begin to think when we're going to these types of resources. I think it's going to become increasingly important that we not think about species that maybe have always done well in the past. This is that rear view mirror, kind of mindset where we think about past conditions, and that past conditions are going to be what we see in the future. We know with the rate of which things are changing around us, that's probably not necessarily going to be the case. So it's important, I think, to not think about those species that have historically done well, but be thinking forward about what are those conditions that we might experience in the future. And with some of these resources, when you can choose characteristics such as looking for those species that can do well with maybe more sun exposure, can do well with maybe less soil moisture, and just help to prepare and choose plants in that way. This is a resource that Audubon has that you may or may not be familiar with. This is Audubon's native plant database. It's not as exhaustive as Lady Bird Johnson's. I mean, that is the gold standard, I think, as far as online native plant databases in the country are concerned. But the Audubon native plant database is really great, and it's a lot of fun because you can search for plants and also get an idea of the birds that they're going to attract, if that's something that you're interested in. And why I wanted to mention it today is because when you go to this search feature, there's an advanced feature that you can choose, and you can actually put in keywords and return species. This is, I put in the word drought, and these are some of the species that were returned in that search. So you can go in to this database and search for keywords for drought tolerant species, for cold tolerant species, and begin to get some of that information as you're thinking about putting your plant, your species lists and your selections together when you're going to that next native plant sale. And then lastly, I just wanted to go back to that thought of when we're choosing native plants, and we're thinking forward, we're thinking about those conditions that we might be seeing in the future, and we're looking for local resources. Look for those native plant sales. This is one, if you're in the Dallas area, at our Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center in Cedar Hill, we've got a native plant sale coming up on the morning of April 30th. Audubon chapters around the state have periodic native plant sales. Your arboreta and nature centers are great places to go. Of course, here in Houston, Mercer Arboretum has a very popular local plant sale every year. But it's just increasingly important to try to source those native plants locally, and think about native plants with that future mindset. We like to say, if you give something an inch, it's going to take a mile. But with invasive plants, we say if you give an invasive plant an inch, it's going to take an acre. And it's just, again, what you all are doing is so important in terms of promoting native plants, putting native plants in the ground. It does so much in terms of increasing our resilience for the future, in terms of reducing the ability of invasives to take hold. I just commend you all for everything that you do around native plants, and really appreciate your attention this morning. These are just a few of the programs that we've got going on at Audubon. I encourage you to go out and visit one of our Audubon centers this year If you haven't done so already, we're in the start of spring migration right now. So it's lights out Texas time, time to dim those lights at night to help our feathered friends along their migration. We've got our Bird City certification program where we've now got bird cities all around Texas that are taking the commitment to put nature-based infrastructure in place and bird conservation practices in place. And a lot of that includes Bird City. There are criteria related to native plants and plants for birds. And then our Texas Women in Conservation Luncheon in San Antonio. If you're dialing in from San Antonio today, that's going to be April 19th. So just thank you all and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. And I will stop sharing.
We really appreciate you sharing with us. I'm going to let Kim handle the chat question.
Well, Martin wants to know, with increased climate change volatility, isn't it hard to select plants that are adapted to both increased drought, flooding, and both high and low temperature extremes?
It is. It's a challenge. I mean, that's the thing, is that we've, really got to think about managing for extremes. But I think that also the way to deal with that, and that comes to the diversity of the plants that we choose. So, trying to get as many different types of plants on your plant lists when you're going and visiting those native plant sales, so that you can have species that are performing well during certain types of conditions. You may have some, if you're choosing those drought tolerant plants that maybe don't do well with the deluges of rain that we get here in Houston, as long as you're also choosing some of those plants that can really handle those wet conditions, you've got species that can maybe step up and, do really great during those times when others maybe aren't performing so well. I think that's the answer. And it's just choosing a diverse list of species to plant in your gardens.
I agree. And Alex goes on to say, do you think we should give up on native plants that are losing their footing due to large factors such as climate change, which you sort of just talked about, or continue planting them and give them opportunities to gather new adaptations in their gene pool?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. And I really don't like the thought of giving up on species. I do think it's important to continue to plant them. And again, I think the answer is that the diversity and, expanding our plant lists to the greatest degree that we can. But I would say, let's definitely not give up on species, and especially when we maybe have species of wildlife such as butterflies or birds that maybe rely on some of these species at certain times of the year and certain parts of their life cycle. It's, I think, important to keep choosing those species, but maybe it's about introducing some of those new species to just kind of help us adapt as time goes on.
So have a very diverse garden.
Exactly.
Rachel Sawinski asks about the NOAA agricultural maps. And she'd like to know if those are based on local weather, or do they take into account things like taking water from other areas?
And I think when we look at those maps, we always have to keep them at kind of a higher scale, a greater scale. And we can't get too local with those maps. I know in those maps, they did show county boundaries, but typically those maps are depicted using some of the larger national data sets, and they may not reflect some of those local conditions that we see, especially those water management actions that are dictated by, state policy, for example. So you're exactly right. We've got, water moving now, and it's going to continue to be shifted between watersheds and river basins. And that's probably not depicted in that map, but certainly that's a factor that could impact those agricultural yields moving forward. I think these maps are really good to kind of give us a general sense of what we can expect in the future.
What is the Audubon Society doing to help eradicate giant cane? Is there any way to kill it besides Roundup?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. You know, when it comes to invasive species, especially those like giant cane, I mean, it's a never, once you've got it, it's a never ending battle. It's just something that you've got to commit to controlling as early and as often as possible. And for us, giant cane is an issue that we deal with, especially down at our Sable Palm Sanctuary in Brownsville, which is right on the Rio Grande. And it's ongoing control, which unfortunately sometimes it includes usually a mix of control methods that can include physical removal, that can include, you know, spot use of herbicides, unfortunately. And we're even thinking about in the future, we're getting ready to create a master plan for that sanctuary, which is going to include a habitat restoration plan that could also bring in use of prescribed burns and fire. So it's really about, for species like that, it's early response, it's continual response, and it's probably a mixed group of methods that you use to control those species. Never ending.
It is never, that's right. We need to not plant any more exotic, non-native plants.
Exactly.
I apologize for using the term exotic. We're trying to go to shared terminology and just call them non-native plants.
I really recommend that book, Saving Us by Katherine Hayhoe, that came out last year. She really gives some great, it's a very positive book, but she really gives some great thoughts and tips on how to talk to people about things that you care about, especially, and I could see that applying to native plants, for example.
Yeah, I've heard her speak. She's very inspiring. Someone wants to know, is there any legislation to outlaw invasives? Goodness, in other states, but not in Texas so far that I know of.
That's right.
Lots of work to do.
That's right. That's something that I think a number of organizations for many years, I've been working on invasive species issues for about 15 years now. And it's been at least that long that folks have been trying to get some things through the legislature, but no, we do not. The closest thing that we have are, you know, some of the lists that are put out by Texas Parks and Wildlife, the Texas Department of Agriculture, that those prohibited species lists. But those prohibited species lists, it's really hard to take that to the next step and really limiting what comes through the agricultural trade. There's been a push to try to shift from prohibited lists to lists of species that can be sold in the agricultural trade, kind of flipping the model, but that's also a tough sell in the Texas legislature. So what we have right now, it's all about spreading the word. It's all about promoting best practices, promoting those plant lists, and trying to educate folks on the impacts of invasive species.
I think for the Native Plant Society, the place we can have the most impact is with growers and nurseries rather than with the agricultural. I mean, that might be a little step beyond our purview now, but maybe in the future. But all of our members can certainly go and request native plants and point out if they're selling invasive plants that's not a good idea.
Exactly.
Somebody mentioned that he thinks that you did recently did a interview with Katherine Hayhoe. Is that right?
It is. That was here in Houston, I guess, last fall. And yeah, it was a virtual event where we had a conversation and an interview. If folks are interested in that, I'd be happy to find that link.
Sure, that'd be great if you could do that.
Sure can.
Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the invitation.
Oh, our pleasure.